The use of films as a means by which to disseminate ideas and influence public opinion is about as old as Hollywood itself. One genre where this has made itself abundantly clear is the war film. From Patton to Platoon, The Deer Hunter to Top Gun, how Hollywood depicts warfare has a direct impact on how we, as Americans, understand combat and its consequences. Because of this, it's important to make sure that Hollywood is getting it right, and to examine any potential biases that filmmakers might employ to try and influence their audiences. With this in mind, I'd like to examine six particular films that are set in the context of American wars to see how they stack up with regards to historical accuracy. Last of the Mohicans, The Patriot, Gone with the Wind, Glory, Best Years of Our Lives, and Born on the Fourth of July. I will be ranking these films predominantly on how historically factual their depictions of warfare and its consequences are. Any historical inaccuracies outside of those two considerations will be factored in as well, but not as heavily. I'll be starting with the film I believe to be the least accurate, and work my way up to the film I think is the most accurate. All sources used to back my argument will be made available in the link in the description of this video. Starting off the list at number 6 is the 2000 film The Patriot. This movie might as well have been released under the genre of fantasy. This film is a work of propaganda that threatens to give Leni Riefenstahl a run for her money, and appropriately so, since The Patriot makes Revolutionary era South Carolina look like Nazi occupied France. This film was so over the top in its depiction of the British Army that it's a wonder any English actors agreed to be in it in the first place. The character Colonel Tavington, based on the real British cavalry commander Bannister Tarleton, seems like a villain out of a comic book. Sure, Tarleton was no angel. His men committed a massacre against retreating Patriot militiamen at the Battle of Waxhaws. But does the Patriot show that? No, of course not. Instead, we're treated to Jason Isaacs shooting children, forcibly conscripting black people, and burning churches full of civilians. Why let the fact that there's no available evidence indicating that Tarleton did any of these things get in the way of some good old-fashioned Brit bashing? The Patriot's historical inaccuracies seem to largely stem from its desire to push some founding myths about the American Revolution. Time and time again, the history of those involved on the side of the Patriot forces has been whitewashed, and this scenario is no exception. The movie makes some effort to portray some of the more negative aspects of the militiamen fighting under Martin, such as one or two scenes involving racist comments and very sparse war crimes in the form of taking no quarter, but seems keen on neglecting some of the more horrific actions undertaken by the real-world militia under Francis Marion, on whom Mel Gibson's character is based. These complaints might seem pedantic. It is an American movie, after all, but it caused some real strife. The British, it turns out, were generally not happy with being depicted as a bunch of red-clad Nazis. And where the hell are all the loyalists? The movie has exactly one prominent loyalist character in the entirety of the film, in spite of the fact that South Carolina was as much a bastion of loyalism as it was patriotism. This aims to reinforce the falsehood that almost every single colonist was raring to go for independence, and that the loyalists were few in number. Why? Because it sounds better for our founding mythos if the lot of us were on the same page from the jump. Lying to ourselves about our history is no way to get along as a society, and it is for that particular reason that the Patriot remains such an egregious offense to the national narrative. Number 5 is the 1939 Civil War epic Gone with the Wind. This film has been criticized to hell and back for its racist depiction of black Americans who work at the Tara plantation. The myth of the happy slave, which is also present in The Patriot, is by far the most problematic part of Gone with the Wind. I want to focus on the root cause of this depiction, the not so subtle pushing of the lost cause myth. The Lost Cause of the Confederacy is a pseudo-historical narrative pushed by white Southerners in the wake of the Civil War that sought to make their rebellion seem just, and to make the North look like an army of invading pillagers. Lost Cause propaganda is sprinkled throughout this film like racist fairy dust, but it rears its ugly head the most in three areas: the aforementioned depiction of happy slaves, the Battle of Atlanta, and the suffering scarlet faces in the aftermath of the war. First and foremost, the enslaved at Tara, and particularly Mammy. There isn't much I can say here that hasn't already been said, so instead I'll echo the words of Louisa Alexander, an enslaved woman in the American South, in a letter to her spouse. My dear husband, I received your letter yesterday, and lost no time in asking Mr. Jim if he would sell me, and what he would take for me. He flew at me, and said I would never get free, only at the point of the bayonet, and there was no use in my ever speaking to him any more about it. I don't see how I can ever get away, except you getting soldiers to take me from the house, as he is watching me night and day. If I can get away, I will, but the people here are all afraid to take me away. I had good courage all along until now, but now I am almost heartbroken. Louisa Alexander. This was the reality of American slavery. Not content mammies sticking with their owners out of loyalty, nor field hands casually finishing up a breezy day's work at the bell. The mundane horror and fear that came with being under the constant threat of violence is something that Gone with the Wind inexcusably fails to depict at even the most basic level. Next, the Battle of Atlanta. Initially, I was going to put Gone with the Wind at the number 6 spot, but what saved it was the film's depiction of destruction that the Civil War brought. Families being shattered as casualty lists are read off. The battered, broken bodies of men lying in rows like a graveyard, almost as far as the eye can see. Gone with the Wind was one of the first major depictions of the American Civil War. The only other major blockbuster film depicting the Civil War battle before 1939 was The Birth of a Nation, which, yeah, is a story for another time. So, yes, at least initially, Gone with the Wind does an acceptable job. Where it starts to slip back into propaganda territory is during the escape scene with Rhett, and the Union soldier who seeks to rob and assault Scarlett back at Tara. The idea of the rampaging, raping, pillaging Yankee in Georgia comes from reactions to Sherman's March of the Sea, which was an early modern instance of total war. While atrocities were committed by Sherman's men, the level of destruction was subsequently played up by Southerners in order to evoke sympathy and demonize the Union Army. So, with this in mind, was the burning of Atlanta depicted accurately? No, no, not really. Sherman didn't put the town's military assets to the torch until after he'd captured the city and the civilians had evacuated. There was no Pompeii like whirlwind of flame and destruction while civilians were evacuating. That was all fabricated for the big screen. Gone with the Wind is a masterclass in propaganda hidden behind innovation and exciting sets and scenery. In this sense, it's a lot like Birth of a Nation. While it gets some parts about the Battle of Atlanta right, its dedication to the lost cause and the downright offensive historical negationism it participates in to get its point across means that I can't place it any higher on this list. My pick for the number 4 spot is 1989's Glory. I want to preface my explanation by stating that Glory is my personal favorite film on this list. The gap in controversy and historical accuracy between it and Gone with the Wind is immense. However, where Glory falls short is in its decision to sacrifice historical accuracy for the sake of telling a story. A story that might be more fitting to all members of the United States Colored Troops, certainly, but not one that was entirely fitting to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. To start, the positives. The battle sequences are actually pretty great. They aren't perfect, like during the assault on Battery Wagner, where they charge in broad daylight rather than moving in cover of darkness as they did in actuality. But it's a nice change of pace to see a depiction of the Civil War that actually looks like a war. Looking at you, Gettysburg. The fact that Glory manages to at least scratch the surface of showing the carnage and gore that made the Civil War so utterly horrific is a testament to its worthiness as a historical piece of filmmaking. Which is why it frustrates me to no end that Glory decided to tell a story completely different from that of the real 54th. The vast majority of men who enlisted in the 54th were not enslaved. They were freedmen from New England, including two of Frederick Douglass's sons. They did not have any difficulties procuring supplies, as this was a personal pet project for the governor of Massachusetts. Their pay struggles legitimately happened, so points to Glory for that, but I fail to see why they couldn't tell this story through a different unit. The 2nd South Carolina, which we see in the film, would have been a great regiment to portray the feelings that ex slaves were going through when they decided to join up and fight against their masters. If you're going to tell the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, tell the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. It's not like their story needed any sprucing up. For instance, the actions of Sergeant William H. Kearney. During the assault on Battery Wagner, the man tasked with holding the regimental colors was killed. Through sheer will, bravery, and dedication, Sergeant Kearney took up the flag and continued to carry it, despite suffering egregious wounds in the process. When he returned to Union lines, he reportedly told the awestruck soldiers around him, "Boys, I only did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground." He was later awarded with the Medal of Honor for his actions. Why is he not in the movie? Why do we have to focus on fictional characters like Tripp, or Rollins, or Thomas, when there are so many real life heroes who fought and died with the 54th? It's pretty telling that the only real life hero that is presented in the movie is a white dude. This one simple but inexcusable sacrifice of historical integrity in the name of writing a different story prevents Glory from being the true historical masterpiece that it should have been, and is the reason why it is only at number 4 on this list. Number 3 is the 1992 flick The Last of the Mohicans, which extensively depicts the siege of Fort William Henry and the massacre that followed the British surrender during the French and Indian War. The depiction of the battle itself is, by all accounts, fine. I've actually had the pleasure of going to the replica of Fort William Henry in Lake George, New York. It's an impressive fortification, and that's without the earthworks that made up a large portion of the defenses. However, while the battle scenes are okay, the depiction of the subsequent massacre is somewhat problematic. For starters, the film depicts the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander during the siege, as attempting to subtly drop hints to Magua that he wants the Huron to obliterate the retreating British column. This never happened. Montcalm had actually done his best to dissuade his Huron allies from violating the terms of the surrender. Also, the massacre didn't result in the wiping out of the British Colonel Monroe or his forces. Modern estimates put the rates of missing and dead at around 7% of the British garrison at the time of the surrender. And as absolutely metal as it was to watch Wes Studi eat someone's heart, this didn't happen either. In fact, Monroe survived the retreat from Fort William Henry and died a few months later from unknown causes. But these deviations are, for the most part, excusable. What I'm interested in is the film's depiction of indigenous Americans, particularly the Huron. Generally speaking, the film's portrayal of the American Indians seems to be alright, though it is, by its very nature, problematic in a sense. To start, the Hurons' relationship with the French appears to be fairly accurate, down to certain members of the Huron people, like Magua, referring to the French as their fathers, as an Ojibwe man did during an address to Alexander Henry in 1763. By some accounts, the Marquis de Montcalm distrusted the Huron, but the Iroquois and French worked well together nonetheless. I thought that the character of Magua served as an admittedly subtle parallel for why certain indigenous groups worked with some colonial powers. His family had been murdered by the British, and so he had gone to the French out of necessity, out of protection. This was the reason that some Native American tribes felt the need to choose one side or the other. They were practically forced to in order to avoid being wiped out by a colonial power or their tribal rivals. Of course, the film could have done a better job in making this a little clearer, rather than just depicting the Huron as the film's antagonists. As for the taking of captives, which occurs later on in the film, this was not a practice that was taboo for certain local indigenous groups. The Abenaki, for instance, participated in the regular seizure of colonists in New England, following British incursions onto their land. The end goal of these seizures were typically for the colonists to end up integrating into the tribe, which is why it makes sense that Magua would want to take one of Monroe's captive daughters as a wife. Is the depiction perfect? No. The film is still based on a pretty racist book from the early 1800s, but the filmmakers made enough of an effort to try and depict 18th century frontier warfare and the place that American Indians had within that context in a manner that was, at the very least, non destructive to the historical narrative. The runner up spot on this list belongs to Oliver Stone's 1989 film Born on the 4th of July. Telling the story of crippled Vietnam veteran and anti war activist Ron Kovich, Born on the 4th of July is probably the film on this list that is trying its hardest to push its political message into the minds of its audience. It does this even more so than The Patriot, which is a feat that I didn't believe was possible. So, with this in mind, it may come as a surprise that Born on the 4th of July remains a pretty accurate representation of Ron Kovich and the experience of Vietnam veterans at large. Kovich, for the purpose of the story, serves as a sort of conduit by which the audience can get a sense of what the men who decided to go to Vietnam to fight were going through. As is articulated by Philip Caputo, many of the young men of the United States were enraptured by the words of men like President Kennedy, by the concept of American exceptionalism, and by the perceived threat that communism presented. As far as they were concerned, Vietnam was a sure thing, and was a just cause that would allow for the blossoming of liberty. In the film, this thought process is spurred on by people like Kovich's mother, who encourages Kovich right up until he decides to join the Marines. Where the movie really shines is in its depiction of the psychological and physical toll that the war had on some of its veterans. Born on the 4th of July pulls no punches in showing even the most graphic, taboo ways in which Kovich's life was negatively impacted by his paralysis. Also, the film's depiction of the social and political tensions during the Vietnam War era presents a glimpse into some of the violent actions that law enforcement took towards protesters in an attempt to silence their dissenting opinions. Is Born on the 4th of July perfect? No, of course not. It takes some creative liberties in attempting to finish Kovich's character arc with regards to a friendly fire incident he was involved in, and invents the character of Donna for some manufactured romance. But in spite of this, it still ranks as one of the more historically accurate films depicting the experience of Vietnam veterans on their return to the United States, and for that reason, it lands in the number 2 spot. The Best Years of Our Lives is unique among the historical films that have thus far been discussed, for the sole reason that it is the only one that is set contemporaneously to the time of its release. For this reason, it's pretty much impossible to suggest that it could be anything other than the most historically accurate film of the bunch. As with Born on the 4th of July, it has its imperfections. The only one that is really worth mentioning is the lack of representation and diversity in its cast of veterans. There were hundreds of thousands of Black, Hispanic, and Asian American soldiers who fought for the United States over the duration of the Second World War. So the fact that our only viewpoint is from white Americans whose experiences likely differed from those of minorities in several crucial ways is somewhat disappointing. But beyond that, The Best Years of Our Lives is a practically perfect representation of the challenges that veterans faced in their return home. It was also very provocative for its time in its depiction of those challenges. For a baseline view of how war was portrayed in Hollywood, take 1941's Sergeant York. York signs up for the Army, becomes a Medal of Honor recipient due to his wartime actions, and, on his return home, is rewarded by marrying his faithful fiancée, Gracie, and has a home built for him by the government. Sergeant York presents the message that fighting for one's country will result in an happily ever after ending. By contrast, The Best Years of Our Lives depicts a less than flattering alternative. One veteran, Homer, lost his hands during combat, and great detail is given to describing how people around him view him differently, and how he now has difficulty performing tasks that had previously been menial. Homer was also portrayed by Harold Russell, an actual veteran who suffered the same fate as his character, which the film should be given credit for. Another man, Al, comes home as an impulsive drunk, which is implied to be due to his wartime service. He is allowed to keep his job at the bank, but struggles to come to terms with the fact that many of his fellow veterans are faring poorly financially after coming home. Unlike York, who has his farm built for him, one veteran who asks Al for a loan finds himself unable to even purchase a farm for himself due to his inability to obtain collateral. Lastly is Army Air Captain Fred. Fred comes home to a wife who has presumably been cheating on him while he is away, and who he eventually divorces over her infidelity. He struggles to find employment, being forced to come to terms with the fact that his wartime service has afforded him no serious benefits back in the States. Fred also suffers from pretty severe PTSD, making The Best Years of Our Lives one of the first films ever to depict the disorder and its effects. In one particularly gripping scene, Fred wanders around an aircraft boneyard and almost seems to yearn for his tenure back in the military until he suffers another one of the debilitating attacks in the cockpit of a B 17. The Best Years of Our Lives was one of a few films in the early decades of Hollywood to make an effort to depict what really happened to veterans after the fighting came to a close, and it does so in a manner that effectively demonstrated that for many men, a return to normalcy is an impossibility. For this effort, and for the effective and accurate manner in which it was executed, The Best Years of Our Lives takes the top spot. Deservedly so. Movies have an impact on the way that we view the world, and war films are no exception. There is a reason why so many believe that some of the most effective pieces of anti war propaganda are those shown on the big screen. Some take liberties in their retelling of the stories of heroism, violence, and homecomings, while others allow the historical stories to guide their screenplayers, often to great effect. Whether built on truth or manufactured by fabrication, there is no denying that these 6 films have influenced how audiences view some of America's most impactful wars.